To welcome everyone into this Dharma talk being held here virtually through Dharma College. And we've been holding these talks in a sense under the occasion, under the umbrella of Vesak. And typically we have Dharma talks under the Bodhi tree during the Tipitaka chanting ceremony. But this year, because of COVID, we could not hold that. So I reached out to our wise elders and requested if we could hear some wise reflections on Dhamma, especially as we are honoring this month of Vesak. So it's really lovely to see you all here again. Some of you are becoming more familiar and some of us are part of Dharma College, so it's lovely to see you on the Saturday afternoon. Here in Berkeley, we're based in the heart of downtown Berkeley. And I would like to warmly welcome Venerable Bhante Sujato, who is known as Ajahn Sujato or Bhikkhu Sujato. He's Australian and a Theravada Buddhist monk, and he was ordained into the Thai forest lineage of Ajahn Chah. A former musician with the post-punk Australian band Martha's Vineyard, Venerable Sujato became a monk in 1994. He took higher ordination in Thailand and lived there for years before returning to Australia. He spent several years at Bodhi Monastery in Western Australia before going on to found Santi Forest Monastery in 2003, where he served as the abbot. I'm sorry, somebody's got their, I'm going to just mute, where he served as the abbot. Following Bhante Sujato's wishes, Santi became a nun's monastery in 2012, and he returned to live in Bodhiyana. In 2005, Bhante Sujato co-founded the Buddhist website Sutta Central, along with Rod Bucknell and John Kelly, to provide access to early Buddhist texts in their original language and to make translations available in modern languages. After being unable to secure copyright-free digital translations of the Pali Canon for Sutta Central, Bhante Sujato moved to the island of Chiang off the coast of Taiwan to undertake the task of creating English translations of the four Nikayas, living there from 2015 to 2018. These translations have since been published on Sutta Central and as free edition books. In 2019, Bhante Sujata moved to Sydney to establish Lokanta Vihara, the monastery at the end of the world, with a long-term student, Bhante Akali Go, to explore what it means to follow the Buddha's teachings in an era of climate change, globalized consumerism, and political turmoil. Today, there's so much more to share about Bhante Sujata, but personally I had the very auspicious occasion to meet him for the first time in Bodh Gaya. And we met in one of the early periods of the formation of the Tipitaka chanting. And at that time, I had no idea where that ceremony would take me. Now we're almost 16 years into doing this, and it is now established as an annual gathering for all of the Theravada nuns and monks to gather together along with lay people. And so it's just been an extraordinary journey for myself and for Richard to meet these wise elders in the Theravada tradition, especially in the Ajahn Chah lineage. I seem to keep bumping into these monks from the Ajahn Chah lineage, and we find just some extraordinary sort of points of cross-section, especially here at Dharma College, where we're really looking at mind and self and exploring that in its deepest level and having conversations around that. Today, we will open the Dharma talk with the theme Wise Reflections on, and I love this title, Fishing for Consciousness. Sometimes the closest things are the hardest to see. The way it will go is we'll be inviting Bhante Sujato to give the talk. And then if you have any questions, many of you know that Richard, who is my husband and also teaches here at Dharma College, will be taking your questions in the chat box. So feel free to ask your questions there, and then he will hand them over to Bhante Sujato. So I hand it over to you, Bhante, and a very warm welcome from Berkeley to you and to everyone else who's here today.
Thank you so much, Wang Mo, and wonderful to see you once again. And also hi to Richard, great to see you again after all these years. And we did manage to catch up all too briefly in Berkeley very shortly before the COVID started to hit. I don't know if I can just say this, but if it's possible, I really like it if participants can turn their cameras on. And I know not everybody can do that, so that's fine. But if you can turn your camera on, I appreciate it, because I like to be able to see who's around. And it's nice to be able to, I can sort of get a feel for how many people are falling asleep and this kind of thing. If it's possible. Okay, there's Susan. How are you going, Susan? Very good. And one more, can I just get a sense of the timing? So what time are we?
We have about an hour and 15 minutes for the talk, and then we have maybe about half an hour for questions, if that's okay with you and your timing.
Okay. Yeah, of course. I'm free this morning. Now, an hour and 15 minutes for the talk sounds long, but anyway, I'll see what I can do.
Oh, well, it could be an hour, but I just wanted to give you enough space.
No, sure.
You could do an hour as you like, Bhante.
All right. Thank you. All right. So, I'll be talking this morning on fishing for consciousness, and I'll explain. Actually, the title "Fishing for Consciousness" is kind of just a bad pun, and so I do apologize for that. But it also has some kind of relation to the talk. As just one, so this was a title which actually Wang Mo suggested to me, and she gave me a quote from the Pali Canon, a very well-known quote, Vijnanang anidasanang anantang sabbato bhang, and I'll be talking more about that quote later on. But I just wanted to, as a preliminary, just mention a couple of things. First thing is that on Friday night, I gave a talk and somebody had seen this advertised and they said to me, so like, you're going to solve the hard problem of consciousness, right? And I'm like, no, probably not. Okay, so all I'm saying is don't get your hopes up, all right? We're going to be discussing a sutta and having a look at some of the context, and I hope clarifying some of the issues around these questions. And, sometimes questions around consciousness and so on are very, very hard because consciousness is slippery. And I'll be talking more about that later on. So personally, I find it's good, and it's meaningful that in our spiritual life, there should be certain things that are hard to conceptualize and hard to grasp at a deep level. And I think that's to be expected because we're dealing with deep matters and deep truths. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we can't clarify certain things. And I admit to retaining a certain, I don't know whether it's a certain empirical or a flavor to the way that I explore the Dhamma, in that I try to clarify what can be clarified. And I don't think we can't say that we can solve everything. And today we're just going to be looking at a sutta. That's all. It's just a sutta. It's not going to solve everything for us, okay? It's just a piece of text. It's a beautiful piece of text. It's from 2,500 years ago. It was originated with the Buddha. But we can't demand too much of a text. It's just words. And so, to me, it's a bit cruel to try to extract too much meaning from words. Actually, one of the lessons that I heard about this, I don't know if you remember, many years ago, maybe in the 90s, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was asked to give some commentary on some verses from the Bible. And there was a conference and he gave some commentary on some of the verses from the Bible. And one of the Christian respondents to his comments said something along the lines of that he appreciated the fact that His Holiness handled those words with kindness. And that was really, to me, really insightful in terms of like how we're looking at our scriptures, because to bring a sense of compassion to those words, to listen to those words with empathy. Right? Just as if we're listening to each other, we want to listen to each other with empathy. And if we're listening to each other with a fault-finding mind, trying to find what's wrong with what you're saying, then we'll never really understand each other. And so, surely we owe the Buddha and the Buddhist tradition that same kind of respect. And that doesn't mean that we have to abandon our critical faculties. It doesn't mean that we have to just mindlessly agree with everything that's in a text or with everything that every teacher says, because then life would be very, very dull. And I don't want to live in a world where everybody agrees with me. This would be a very boring world. But I also don't want to live in a world where we can't agree on some things and help to advance our conversation. So hopefully in this sutta, the sutta itself gives us some nice clues as to this, how to advance a conversation. Now, so that's one thing I just wanted to mention as a preliminary. The second thing I wanted to mention as a preliminary is that I actually, purely by coincidence, gave a talk on a similar topic just yesterday, and for an Indonesian group called the Buddhist Channel. Now, I'm just looking at their channel on YouTube now, and the talk that I've gave yesterday hasn't appeared yet on there. So I wanted to give you a link for that talk, but it doesn't seem to be there yet. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw a link in the chat. If anybody is interested, they can check this channel out with the caveat that the actual thing that I'm linking to doesn't exist. So I apologize for that, but hopefully it will exist in the next couple of days. And the reason I'm doing that is because in that talk, I talked about some of the same issues I'm going to be talking about today, but I talked about it in more of a general sense. So if you're interested in sort of the how I approach these problems and talk about a lot of these issues around vijnana, around consciousness, around what we call nama rupa, name and form, and so on, then I discuss these in that talk, which hopefully will at some point magically appear on that YouTube channel that I just shared. Okay. So, before we go on, how are you all? Are you all good? Is everyone good? Yeah, it's good to see you. And some familiar faces, some unfamiliar faces. And, if you like, you can just drop into the chat and just share how you are, because we kind of live in a world where we have lost touch with a lot of people. And I'm seeing people that I've, old friends and things. And I'm like, oh, my goodness. So just don't be shy to just drop by the chat and just let people know how things are going. It'd be nice if I could chat with all of you individually, but we'll probably run out of time. All right, so we're going to discuss today the Kewada Sutta, and especially we're going to look at, I'm most interested to look at questions of narrative and context. And I'm going to try to highlight some ways that we can use to read suttas. And the reason I'm going to do this is because, I think that in, the world today, we have a lot of access to suttas. We have a lot of access to texts and readings and these kinds of things. But it's important that we learn how to read these things, because it's subtle, and the manner of reading sacred scripture is not the same as the manner of reading a novel or reading a contemporary Buddhist book or something like that. And so I want to try to share with you some of the tips and some of the approaches that have proved useful for me in my experience. Okay, so the Kevada Sutta, if you want to pull that up for yourself, actually I should share the link for that, or if someone can share the link, that would be great. Otherwise, I will just pull this up briefly on Sutta Central slash DN, what is it, DN 11. So it's Digha Nikaya number 11, and it is, here is a link to the translation on Sutta Central. Oops, somehow, oh, Mike's already put it in there, and somehow, oh, Karen's put it in there. Thank you, I put it in there. We now have 3 links. Excellent, that's great. So I'll just give a little bit of background to this collection. So we're dealing with the sutta from the Pali Canon here. On Sutta Central, we have suttas from all of the different backgrounds and schools of Buddhism. We focus on those texts which are known in scholarly circles as the early Buddhist texts, and they are the Pali Canon and suttas which are similar to the Pali Canon. I won't be doing a major comparative study here on this particular text, although there has been significant comparative studies with Chinese and Tibetan and other versions of this, but that would lead me a bit too far astray. But I hopefully will introduce a few insights from comparative study during the class. The Kevada Sutta itself is part of the Digha Nikaya. And one of the characteristics of the Digha Nikaya as a collection is that most of the suttas here are about the dealings of the Buddha and the Buddhist and their followers with non-Buddhists. All right? Most of the suttas in the Digha Nikaya consist of the Buddha speaking with people who are not Buddhists. And this is really interesting. That's something that we find throughout all of the early Buddhist texts, but especially in the Digha Nikaya. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is that if we look at later Buddhist literature, all the different sutras and commentaries and shastras and all of these kinds of things, almost all of them are concerned with Buddhists talking with other Buddhists. And but that's not the world that the Buddha himself lived in. The Buddha didn't live in a Buddhist country. He lived in India in 500 BC, where, much like India today, there was all kinds of people who believed all kinds of things. And it was just as diverse and wild and fascinating and frustrating as it is today. And the Buddha traveled across this area and spoke with all kinds of different people. And so one of the things that we find in these discourses, and especially especially in some of the discourses in the Digha Nikaya, but also many others, is we're given examples of how the Buddha approached interfaith dialogue. And he is talking with people from different backgrounds of all different attitudes, sometimes neutral, sometimes favorable, sometimes skeptical, sometimes downright antagonistic. And so these give us a model for how to approach interfaith dialogue. And it's also, I think, worth noting that, obviously there are a lot of, a lot of things have changed since those days. This is 2,500 years ago in ancient India, and we can't read our own assumptions from the present day back into that time. But it's also true to say that there's a lot of continuity, and that a lot of the groups of people like the Brahmins and the Jains and so on that the Buddha was encountering in those days, we still encounter here today. And when we, living in Harris Park in an Indian area, we go for Pindabata, we see our local Indian community gathering in the local park and singing ancient Vedic hymns and homage to the Hindu gods. We see, we go past a house just on the corner down here where there is a lovely Jain family who take care of their bunny rabbits in their backyard. And we know that Jainism is one of the principles of Jainism is non-harming. and one of the great philosophies that they share in common with Buddhism. And so this Jain family, they have these bunny rabbits that they've rescued from here and there. They just live in a block of flats down the road here. And if you go by in the morning, you'll see like one of the sons of the families or something like that will be kind of wrapped up in the cold and will come down with the bunny rabbits and sit there for an hour while the bunny rabbits play in the backyard, and he's just looking after them. And, you know, we stop by and, you know, say hello and share a few words with them. And you can see that people are still practicing these philosophies and that they still mean something to them, you know? And they're still guiding people's words. And in fact, we when we take our bowl for alms in our local street, one of the lovely things is that everybody gives to us. And we go to our local Sikh restaurant and they will always give something. The local Muslim greengrocers will always give us a big pile of fruit and vegetables. The Hindu shops, Nepalese shops, everybody will give something for us. And when we went there with I'm here with my friend Venerable Akaliko, and one time he brought one of his friends, who's one of the a local fellow from Sydney, came with us on the alms round, and he saw all the people from the Hindus and the Muslims and the Sikhs, and everybody was giving to us. And he said, "Oh," he said, "but I thought that they were the competition." And we say, and as somebody who'd grown up in like a secular background, his impression was that religions were always at each other's throats, and that was what we did. And I'm like, no, we don't actually like really think that way, you know. And yeah, sure, sometimes religions are at each other's throats, but most people, most of the time, are not like that. And so, you know, we live in a way in that similar kind of multicultural and very diverse environment that the Buddha was living in. All right. Now, I'll begin by reading the sutta. Now, this sutta is also another bit of context I have to mention, that in this particular sutta is in the Digha Nikaya, the long discourses, but as we will find out when reading it, is that this particular discourse is not, in fact, all that long. I mean, it's longish, but it's not that long. What's it doing in the Digha Nikaya? Well, it's part of the first chapter of the Digha Nikaya, which consists of 13 suttas, which all share one long passage. And so that long passage is abbreviated in most of the suttas that we find here. And so this is worth mentioning, and it's worth understanding, because the content of the suttas that we have is sometimes determined by the context in which those suttas are found. Now, theoretically, this particular sutta contains that whole extra long passage, which I'll refer to later on in the discussion. But in reality, it doesn't. In reality, that's excised, and we're supposed to fill that in. And so this is one of the things this is showing us, is how these scriptural collections that we have were passed down through many hands. And the hands of the redactors and the mouths of the reciters influence the manner in which these scriptures appear to us. And when we see that this text has been abbreviated because it has a long portion, then this tells us something about our shared humanity, because we understand that people in the past were just as lazy as we are. Because they got to this bit and they said, "Oh, I'm not going to write out this whole bit again. I'm just going to refer back to the previous one," right? And that's what you or I would do. You'd do it once or twice, and then you'd be like, "Nah, let's just refer back." And so these are how these texts are shaped through a community. And so when we're reading them, when we're reading ancient scripture, we need to maintain a sort of a balanced posture that doesn't lean too much into the side of like every single word here is exactly the same as spoken by the Buddha 2,500 years ago. This is an extreme position, and we can't substantiate that. On the other hand, it's also an extreme position to say nothing here is knowable, nothing here is, you know, spoken by the Buddha, and we just have to abandon any attempt to know things. And this is an extreme position which doesn't agree with the evidence. What we try to do is to maintain a poised posture and a balanced posture in the middle, where we have an empathy with the text and an understanding where we can receive it and try to look at it and try to see what it means, and to be able to make meaningful distinctions between what is knowable and what is unknowable. Yeah? Some things we can never know, or at least, some things the scripture will come to an end, and we can't say anything more about that. But all we can do, sorry, the sun's rising behind me, so I'm just going to adjust this to try to minimize the glare. All right, I might be moving this around a little bit in the talk. I can, and just for those of you who weren't here earlier, I can just assure you that this is not a spiritual manifestation happening behind me. This is purely the sunrise, just saying. Okay. All right, so yeah, it is a bit symbolic, though, I have to admit, given the subject of the talk. But anyway, moving along. So we begin. So have I heard? Oh, and so I'm reading from sort of Central, and of course, it's my translation. So I can't blame anyone if there's any mistakes here. Oh, actually, I think there is a mistake. I was reading it the other day and I found a mistake there, which I've now since fixed, but I'm not sure if it's gone live yet. All right, so I've heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Nalanda in Pavarika's mango grove. And those of you who have been with Wangmo and Richard at Bodh Gaya, or who have otherwise been to the chanting ceremony or the Indian holy sites will know that Nalanda is just down the road from Rajagaha. And so it was very much in the central part of where the Buddha lived. And Nalanda itself at that time was probably not a large place. It was probably it's mentioned a number of times, probably a medium-sized town, I'm guessing. But because it was on the road from Rajagaha up to the then Vajjian Republic, north of the Ganges, so somewhere that the Buddha passed through on a number of occasions. Of course, became much more famous later on when it was the site of the great Buddhist university there. Then, and he's staying in the mango grove, and one of the common dwelling places that the Buddha would stay in was mango groves. I've never stayed in a mango grove in India, but all I can say is that in Thailand, the mango groves are full of these really vicious, biting red ants, which love to eat the mango juice. So I just hope that the mango groves in India don't have those same red ants, because that would be very unpleasant. Okay, so then Kewata, the householder, went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side and said to him. Now, I'll just, a couple of just incidental details here. First of all, just the word householder, which we find commonly throughout the suttas. It's a bit of one of the things which is tricky in translating the suttas is words which refer to a particular social status, because often those social distinctions and so on are quite different in our culture, and it's a bit hard to relate to them. Householder is not the same as layperson, all right? So a householder, when we say a householder in the suttas, it doesn't just mean any old layperson. It means literally a householder. It's gahapati. It means the owner of a home. And it means somebody who is essentially a person of some stature, a landowner, right? So a gahapati is somebody who is an owner of a house. I mean, it's used fairly generally and fairly widely, but that's the basic meaning of it. So the householder Kewada. Now the name Kewada is a little bit mysterious, and there are a number of variant readings for it. One of the readings is Kewata, which the root text I have here says, and Kewata it means a fisherman. So this is where I got the title Fishing for Consciousness from. And it really is just that bad of a pun, and I apologize for that. But also the sutta itself is somewhat of a search. So I thought that kind of captured the idea of a search. I'm not convinced that Kewata is the actual reading. In my translation, I give Kewada as the reading. And in cases where the readings vary in names, which they do commonly, then I have usually adopted the Sinhala reading, which is the one which is mostly used by Western translators, such as Bhikkhu Bodhi, rather than if you're looking on sort of Central, our root Pali text here is the Burmese text. So sometimes, especially with the spellings of names, that they tend to vary a lot. So I've generally just gone with the most common reading and used the Sinhala form of the name, just in case anybody's wondering that the names are sometimes spelled differently. That's why that is. All right. So Kevadda comes, bows to the Buddha, sits to one side and says to him. Now, this is a stock passage, but it's important in the context of the narrative because it's indicating Kevadda's relationship to the Buddha. Right? The fact that he comes up to the Buddha, he bows respectfully and sits to one side, that tells us as a piece of subtext that Kevadda knows the Buddha and that he is a devout follower of the Buddha. And somebody who is, a non-Buddhist or somebody from a different background would, stand and talk to the Buddha or would speak in a different kind of relationship. So this is one of the little clues which the text is dropping to us as to the relationship between the interlocutor and the Buddha himself. Kevadda says, "Sir, this Nalanda is successful and prosperous and full of people. Sir, please direct a mendicant to perform a demonstration of superhuman psychic power. Then Nalanda will become even more devoted to the Buddha." Now, I mean, this might seem like a bit kind of over the top, right? I mean, to actually go up to a monk and like just say this out of the blue. But I mean, I'll tell you quite frankly, people have said exactly this to me. And so this is not unrealistic at all. And I've absolutely had people come up to me and say, "Oh, you're a forest monk, you've been living for many years, you've been meditating, you must have these psychic powers and abilities. Please show these psychic powers so that everybody can gain more faith in Buddhism." Like literally exactly like that. So the first thing that when this happens is I have to disabuse them and say, "Well, actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but no, I don't have any psychic powers. But if I did, then I wouldn't be showing them off like this." And so the Buddha, this wasn't really the Buddha's style, as we shall find out later. A couple of notes on the translation here. I've used the word mendicant to translate the Pali bhikkhu, and I do this throughout for two reasons. So bhikkhu is typically translated either as monk or is left untranslated. And I translated it as mendicant because A, it's the literal meaning of the word. Right? A bhikkhu means somebody who's wandering for alms. And I think it's important to mention that because that's a minority practice these days. Most bhikkhus don't wander for alms. And unless we're reminded of the fact that that's what literally the meaning of the word is, then we miss out on that particular part of the Buddhist heritage. The second word the second reason for using the word mendicant is because it's a gender neutral term. And in the suttas, particularly, the word bhikkhu is generally used as a word indicating all monastics. And in the minority of instances, it's used to indicate specifically the male monastics, i.e. the monks. So for that reason that I prefer to use the word mendicant. All right, and generally speaking, in my translation, it is a gender neutral translation. So I only specify gender when it is relevant to the narrative. Okay, when he said this, the other thing I wanted to comment on here is this word that I've translated as demonstration. And the Pali there is patiharya, and the word patiharya is typically translated as miracle. And in the later Buddhist tradition, it did indeed have that sense of a miracle, of a display of psychic power of some kind of miraculous event. Now you can see here that it's used in that way, but the problem is the word I think has been overinterpreted because of the context in which it's used. Yes, sometimes it's used in the context of a display or a demonstration of psychic power, but it's not always used in that context. The word itself doesn't mean that. The word itself means a demonstration or a display. And it doesn't itself mean a display of something miraculous. So I think it's a slightly misleading translation to translate it as a miracle itself. It means a display or a demonstration. All right. When he said this, the Buddha said, Kevada, I do not teach the mendicants like this. Come now, mendicants, perform a demonstration of superhuman psychic power for the white-clothed lay people. For a second time, Kevada made the same request, and the Buddha gave the same answer for a third time. And then the Buddha said the following. Kevada, there are three kinds of demonstration, which I declare having realized them with my own insight. What three? The demonstration of psychic power, the demonstration of revealing, and the demonstration of instruction. And what is the demonstration of psychic power? It's when a mendicant who wields the many kinds of psychic power, multiplying themselves, becoming one again, going unimpeded through a wall, a rampart, or a mountain as if through space, diving in and out of the earth as if it were water, walking on water as if it were earth, flying cross-legged through the sky like a bird, touching and stroking with the hand the sun and the moon, so mighty and powerful, controlling the body as far as the Brahma realm. So this is a stock passage found in the suttas on psychic powers or idhi. And the role of these psychic powers or idhi within Buddhism are always, of course, a little bit contested. And typically the Buddha would say that there's more, these things can be generated as more of a kind of a byproduct of meditation rather than as a goal of meditation. Whether you believe that all of these things are possible or not, all I can say about this, okay? Can we believe these or not? Okay, it reminds me of when Richard and Wangmo, we were staying in that Japanese temple in Bodh Gaya, and one evening I was sitting there. It was late in the evening. Came back, and there was one of the local sadhus who was there, and we were having a chat about various kinds of things, and he just dropped casually into the conversation. I can levitate, right? I can fly. Would you like to see? Because, and one of my great regrets as a monk is that when he said this, I was just like too cool for school, and I was like, no, it's all right. Yeah, I'm not really interested. That's fine. Don't have to fly. So I never got to see it. So I never got to see whether that was actually true or not. So, yeah. If there was one thing that I could undo in my life, that may be it in terms of a bad decision. So anyway, I'm not going to say too much about these particular things that would lead us too far astray and whether I believe that they're all possible. I will say that I think that the mind is amazing and that humanity is amazing and that we don't understand everything about how the world works. And I think that as time goes on, that we will learn that there are more things possible than we maybe imagine today. But whether we're going to see people flying through the sky or anything anytime soon, I'm not entirely sure. All right, but then what to do about this? Then that somebody with faith and confidence sees that mendicant performing these superhuman feats, right? Notice the qualifier here, right? This is a specific qualifier in this context, somebody with faith and confidence. They tell somebody else who lacks faith and confidence. It's incredible, it's amazing that ascetic has such psychic power and might. I saw him myself performing all these superhuman feats. But the one lacking faith and confidence would say to them that there's a spell named Gandhari. Using that, a mendicant can perform such superhuman feats. What would you think, Kevado? Would someone lacking faith speak like that? They would, sir. Seeing this drawback in psychic power, I'm horrified, repelled, and disgusted by demonstrations of psychic power. So here the Buddha is pointing to one of the major drawbacks of these things. And interesting that he talks about this vijja, this spell called Gandhara, or Gandhari. And these days, of course, we know Gandhara as the region to the northwest of India, of modern-day India, in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. Gandhari is a language. My friend here in Sydney, Mark Allen, is one of the leading experts in the Gandhari language. He actually, he'd be a good person to get on for one of these talks. I'm just saying, he's not a monastic, but he's really got a good knowledge of these things.
Okay.
So here, the Gandhari seems to be associated with some kind of mystical realm where you would get some kind of psychic knowledge from. Now, in the Buddha's time, and around that period, the renowned center of knowledge was Taxila, which was, of course, in Gandhara, and that's where people would go to learn and to study. So presumably, this is one of the things that people would learn there, would be these kinds of spells. So the point here is essentially that you can fake it. So you can, it's easy to fake these things. And, surely this is obvious from the modern day. India, apart from being full of all other kinds of things, is full of fakes and full of people who are faking all kinds of psychic powers and magic displays and all of these kinds of things. And most of them are extremely easy to do. And it's extremely easy to fool people with them. And I know monks, unscrupulous monks who do this kind of thing. For example, the light behind me even reminds me of one example. I was once with a group of monks in northern Thailand, and we were traveling, and we ended up at a cave, and we're at a cave complex near the Lao border in northern Thailand, and we went just exploring through the cave, and it was really fun. And one of the monks, like we were with a group of monks from the local forest monastery, but one of the monks who was with us was like a sort of random wandering monk who just ended up with us for some reason. And I remember that he wanted to get a photo taken of himself in this cave, and he sort of climbed up to a ledge where he was like sitting on a ledge and getting somebody to photograph him as if he's like sitting in this cave, almost suspended in midair. And he got his torch, and he happened to leave his torch so that the light of the torch was shining behind his head when the photograph was taken. And and that kind of thing. It's so easy to do that kind of thing. I know of another monk whose shtick is when he's introduced to new people, especially when they look like they're wealthy new people, that they'll be introduced and he'll say, we meet again. And they're like, oh, does he see something? Do we know each other in our past lives? No. And so it's very easy to do these things, even when you don't mean to. When I was in northern Thailand, again, staying at the same place, I asked the owner of the hut that I was in to make a walking meditation path for me. And they came and they made a nice walking meditation path. And when it was finished, or when they'd marked out the ground, then I stepped along the ground to count the number of steps, because we usually measure a walking path by the number of steps. And so I counted them. And then one of the workers said, how many steps is that? I said, whatever, 38 steps. He said, oh, okay. And then I noticed when I was going for alms round to the local village after that, I've been going to that place for maybe 6 months. And there's some, you'd see the same people every day. And, sometimes you get to know people and chat with people a little bit. Other times people will just come out, give a little bit of rice, and then you move on. And so one of these fellows came out who I'd seen again and again, but I'd never spoken to him. And on this one day, he came out and he said, have you had any dreams lately, Bhante? I said, I'm sorry? He said, have you had any dreams lately? No. And anyway, I went back to my hut. So it turns out that when those workers got back, they decided that the number of steps, the number 38 that I'd given them, was, of course, a magic number, so that they'd use that to buy a lottery ticket, and then they'd won some money on the lottery. So then it was like, oh, this Western monk can see everything and he can give you lottery numbers. So this is what they do in Thailand. They say, have you had any dreams lately? So this is like a kind of shorthand, so that I'm not like explicitly giving people lottery numbers, but I say, oh, I had a dream of the number 43 last night, and then they can use that. So anyway, that's how easy it is to do these things. So the Buddha was not into this kind of thing. All right. Right. So that's the first demonstration. Second demonstration. What's the demonstration of revealing? In one case, somebody reveals the mind, mental states, mentality, thoughts, and reflections of other beings and individuals. This is what you're thinking, such is your thought, and such is your state of mind. Someone with faith and confidence sees that mendicant revealing in others' thoughts. They tell somebody who lacks faith and confidence. It's incredible. It's amazing. The ascetic has such psychic power and might. I saw him myself revealing the thoughts of another person. But the one lacking faith and confidence would say to them, there's a spell called Manika. Using that, a mendicant can reveal another person's thoughts. So what do you think, Kevada? Wouldn't someone lacking faith speak like that? They would, sir. Seeing this drawback in revealing, I'm horrified, repelled, and disgusted by demonstrations of revealing. Oh, okay. So the spell, this time the spell called Manika, which means like the jewel or the gem. I should also mention that the word I'm translating here as spell is Vija, which literally means a knowledge or a science. And it probably means something like a spell, but it could actually mean really anything which is used as a sort of knowledge that's to sort of bring about this kind of result. So it could be a sort of a method of fakery or something anyway. Now, one of the things which I think is interesting about this kind of dialogue is it's based on the idea of cognitive bias. And so we see the two people who are having this conversation. One of them has faith and they see it and they immediately believe it. The other one doesn't have faith, they see it, they don't believe it. And so the Buddha is quite explicitly introducing into this dialogue the fact that our cognitive bias will shape what we believe to be true and will shape how we see things. And also interesting that he's kind of landing on the side of the person who has less faith and confidence. Right? He's landing on the side of the skeptic and warning us that excessive credulity will easily lead us to mistaken conclusions. Now, he's not saying that none of these things can happen, and he's not saying that we should disbelieve everything we say. He's just saying that we should just be careful. And of course, the method that he's using is one of the methods which is fundamental to scientific research, which is to understand that a result can have many different causes. And we can't assume that a particular result was brought about by a specific cause until we've tested it. And so this is one of the basic methods of scientific research, is to propose a number of different hypotheses that might explain a given phenomenon, and then to do experiments that will try to rule out the different hypotheses to see if we can arrive at a conclusion. So the Buddha is here using that similar kind of approach to warn us that we can't just arrive at the most naive and most obvious theory, because sometimes these things can come about through many different ways. Now, this particular one of having an insight or a grasp as to what people are thinking is obviously less, I guess, less extreme or less out there than the previous one of like walking through the air and these kinds of things, right? And now clearly, I mean, there's any number of magicians and stage, performers who will do this kind of trick where they will read people's minds or seem to read people's minds. And, clearly somebody with intuition, somebody who's studied body language, somebody who has, ways of getting insight into people's attitudes and thoughts and beliefs can do this to a certain degree. And I believe that, without getting into it in too much, I believe that in Buddhism, when we talk about people reading people's minds, it's not completely separate from that. It's not completely separate from ordinary intuition. Right? I believe, and I'm not going to sort of try to justify this scientifically, but I believe that we've evolved to sort of intuit people's minds around us, and that our minds do interrelate to each other, sometimes through, visual cues and so on. But, just we get a sense. You walk into a room and you get a sense for the mood of the room. And that's a kind of intuition which we have. And through meditation, we will deepen that sense of intuition. And we will learn to become more sensitive and more mindful of others and to what they're thinking and so on. Now, whether that means specifically knowing what they're thinking, or whether that means getting a sense for their emotional perspective, But meditation will allow us to be more clear about that. And I think it's also worth noting that most of the time when the Buddha talked about being aware of other people's minds, most of the time he was focusing more on the emotional state of people's minds rather than the thoughts. And whether somebody is feeling angry or not, whether somebody is feeling greedy or not. These kinds of things are this more kind of like an overall disposition, emotional disposition of a person's mind, rather than knowing the specific thoughts. So, so this is the second one. So, but it's interesting also that the Buddha was not into this, right? So he's not into just sort of reading people's minds and telling them what they think. The next one. And I should mention also, since Wangbo, you mentioned the Ajahn Chah tradition at the beginning, one of the stories that I learned there from Ajahn Jayasara used to tell this story, or was it Ajahn Pasana? Can't remember. Anyway, somebody used to tell this story that somebody came to see Ajahn Chah and they asked him, oh no, actually it was Ajahn Sumedho who told this story. He said that someone came to see Ajahn Chah and asked him, do you read the minds of your disciples and tell them how to meditate? And Ajahn Chah said, here at my monastery, we learn to read our own minds. So the last one, demonstration of instruction. It's when a mendicant instructs like this: think like this, not like that. Focus your mind like this, not like that. Give up this and live, having achieved that. This is called the demonstration of instruction. Upasampadja viharata. I might have to change this translation, actually. The last part which I've translated, live having achieved that, it probably doesn't, what it actually means, idang upasampadja viharata, it's an idiom which is invariably used in describing the 4 jhanas. So probably what it means is to, practice jhanas, actually is what it's saying. And I should probably change my translation to reflect that. So the kind of demonstration that the Buddha is in favor of is a demonstration of being able to teach people how to use their mind and focus their mind in a way that's going to lead to giving up of unwholesome qualities and to develop wholesome qualities. Then the Buddha goes on to teach what we call the gradual training. And the gradual training is the long passage that I mentioned at the beginning, which is mostly omitted here, and it's found only in abbreviation. Now, it's tempting when reading it. In fact, it's almost inevitable when reading these things that we will kind of pass over these abbreviated passages and we don't necessarily notice the full significance of it. But I think it's important when reading it to at least remind ourselves of what that full passage is. If we're not familiar with it, go back and check it. And because this gives us an important context for what this teaching is. So here, what's happening is that it's not that when the Buddha is talking about the demonstration of instruction, he's not just saying, do this and do this, use your mind in this way and don't use your mind in that way, but he's also following it up through showing the actual practice of somebody who does this. And so this is why it begins, think like this, not like that, focus your mind like this, not like that. And this is talking about developing our path, abandoning the unwholesome, the 4 right efforts and so on. Give up this, but in the context, give up this means to abandon especially the 5 hindrances, which is those qualities that are stopping us from entering into deep meditation. And to upasampadja viharata, as I mentioned, is a phrase specifically associated with the jhanas, which is, of course, what the Buddha is teaching a little bit later in the text. So in that brief instruction, the summary of it really means to practice the entirety of the gradual training, letting go, giving up everything, dedicating yourself to meditation, abandoning the hindrances of the mind and going into deep meditation and realizing the fruits of that deep meditation up to and including arahantship. As is indicated by the final phrase there is no return to any state of existence. And this is a stock phrase indicating arahantship. So the Buddha summarizes this by saying, Kevada, these are the 3 kinds of demonstration which I declare, having realized them with my own insight. Okay. So that concludes the first portion of the sutta. And we now go on to the second portion of the sutta, which is on the mendicant in search of the cessation of being. Bhuta nirodhesaka bhikkhu vatu. For those of you, again, just as a bit of a note, when reading the suttas, remember that all of the titles in suttas were added by later editors. There are a few places where suttas are given a title in the sutta itself. For example, in the Brahmajala Sutta, the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya. But even there, we see that, say, the Buddha might suggest a number of different titles. So it's not like there was one fixed title for a sutta. So when we see titles or headings or subheadings in suttas, remember that these were added by editors in order to clarify the structure of the text, and they don't actually belong to the text itself. All right. And that's why, incidentally, on Sutta Central, you'll always see that those titles are grayed out. So the grayed out portions indicate that they're added by later editors. Once it so happened, Kevada, that a mendicant in this very Sangha had the following thought: where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air? All right, so this is the question. So this is important context to remember. The question is, where does the earth, water, fire, and air cease without anything left over? That, what is that? What does he mean? Like, what kind of question is that? Or why is he kind of asking this, and how is this relevant for a spiritual path? Okay, so a bit of background here. First thing is that, just to notice from a physical point of view, is that these four elements correspond very closely to the four states of matter recognized in modern physics, right? So earth is solidity, water is liquidity, fire is the state of plasma, and air is, of course, the state of a gas. So these things are still very much in accord with how modern physicists see things. But here, the difference is that in Buddhism, we don't see the physical world primarily from an external and objective point of view. The physical world in contexts like this is seen as it is experienced. That is to say, this is the inner experience in consciousness of solidity, of liquidity, of plasma or heat, of movement or air. And that's something that you can experience as you're sitting there listening to this talk. You can experience that your seat has a certain hardness to it. You can experience that the air around you has a certain gaseous quality and movingness to it. You can feel that, say, in your mouth, there's a liquid. You can feel that there's a sensation of warmth or cold. And this is your experience, your subjective experience of these four elements. And in the context of meditation, this is what these four elements is referring to. Now, these four elements are prominently used as a framework to guide meditation. And we find this many times in a lot of detail in the early suttas. In fact, in the Pali suttas, four elements meditation is probably taught in more detail than any other kind of meditation. And the same thing is true in the Visuddhimagga as well, the great Theravadan meditation manual, which teaches the four elements in a lot of detail. So there are many ways of practicing this meditation, right? Lots of different approaches, lots taught in the suttas, lots developed in later times as well. There's not just one way of doing it. But one of the things that we find in the suttas is that often these four elements were used as a basis for developing jhanas. Now, we've already seen that jhanas have been mentioned before in this abbreviated passage, and the Buddha is already referring to this. The monk here is in the next sentence said to attain a state of immersion, attain a state of samadhi, i.e. a state of jhana, so that he can go and visit the gods and say, "G'day, how's it going?" Right? Well, if he was an Australian monk, that's probably what he would say. But anyway, I'm just giving a colloquial translation here. So my point here, so that when I say that these things are the four elements, that they represent the attainment of jhana, then I'm not just arbitrarily imposing this on the text. Okay, this is the point that I'm trying to convey here. The text gives us a context, and that context is not that this monk has been looking for, or the Buddha has been, or anyone in the sutta has been looking for the reality of the external physical world. right? I mean, that's what it kind of sounds like when he's asking this question. Where do all of these physical elements land? But nobody in this sutra has been concerned for that. What they have been concerned for is how do we advance in the spiritual path? How do we let go of suffering? And specifically has been mentioned the development of the jhanas. And so often we find that this is like one of the little shorthands that the suttas use. And it's worthwhile knowing that because it crops up in a lot of different contexts that don't quite make sense until we understand that the four elements are like a stand-in for the development of jhana. Another thing that occurs in this way might be, say, the Brahma Viharas, which also can be used as a framework for developing jhana. And sometimes in the suttas, we also find that these sort of crop up as a substitute for the four jhanas. Okay, so where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over? And we know that this mendicant can get into jhanas. So what he in fact is saying is that I've got jhanas based on these four elements, which means the first four jhanas. How can I get to a state where these things cease, i.e. the formless jhanas, what they call the arupa samapatti, arupa attainments? Right? So this is specifically the question that he's asking. He's not asking a metaphysical statement about the end of the world or the physical world. He's saying, I've got these meditations, how do I get beyond them? And it's not really said about why he did this, but I mean, my guess would be, I don't know, how literally are we supposed to take this? Is this a journalistic record of exactly what happened? I can't say, right? It's being told as like a fable or a story. So I'm not going to make any claims about the historicity of this, but in terms of the internal narrative cohesion, why would this monk do this? My guess would be that the Buddha taught the four jhanas very often, especially in that teaching on the gradual training, which we've already encountered. And in that teaching on the gradual training, the Buddha teaches jhanas, and he doesn't teach the formless attainments. Right? So in Buddhism, that often those four jhanas are considered to be sufficient, and based on that, we can attain enlightenment. And so my guess would be that this monk had heard that gradual training teaching, had heard the Buddha teaching the four jhanas, and then had attained those, but hadn't gone into a deeper level of insight. So then maybe he's hearing, these Brahmins and these Brahmas, they know about more about that. They know about higher states of meditation. Now, is that true? Is that real that the Brahmins knew about four higher states of meditation, the formless attainments? Probably is. Why do I say that? Because the Buddha's former teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, who were from probably Brahmanical tradition, taught the formless attainments. Not only in that context, but in the Sola Sapanha of the Sutta Nipata, there's 16 Brahmins who come to ask the Buddha about questions, and a number of them ask about deep states of meditation which correspond with the formless attainments. So in my opinion, the Brahmins at the time of the Buddha, the sort of the elite, the peak of the greatest rishis and sages in the time of the Buddha were practicing these formless attainments. And so my guess is that perhaps this monk had heard some of these stories and thought that these Brahmas knew about these deeper states of meditation, which I haven't heard about in the gradual training. That's my supposition as to what was going on in the background here. All right, so then mendicant attained a state of concentration, such that, or a state of immersion, such as a path to the gods appeared. And I never use concentration for samadhi. It means immersion. Such a state to the path of the gods appeared. Then he approached the gods of the four great kings. So these are like the lowest level gods, and asked them, Reverends, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over? The gods said to him, Mendicant, we too do not know this, but the four great kings are our superiors, they might know. So of course, this is this kind of pattern. Then he approached the four great kings. They also did not know it, the gods of the 33, Saka, the lord of gods, the gods of Yama, the gods of Suyama, the joyful gods, the gods of Santusika, those who delight in creation, the god named Sumitta, the gods who control the creation of others, and the god named Vasavati, and the gods of Brahma's host. So he went up to all of these, and they all said that they don't know. And again, without going into too much detail, but this is obviously reflecting the Buddhist cosmology, the different levels of rebirth, which are supposed to correspond with the karma that we make, and you get reborn in these kinds of worlds. And according to the theory of Buddhism, essentially that rebirth in any of these kinds of realms is generated by a kind of worldly karma. So if you do something like keeping precepts or being generous or being kind or something like that, then you can be reborn in any of these realms. But the higher realms are dependent on developing the deep states of meditation, developing jhanas, so that those gods in the Brahma's realm got there through practicing jhanas. Okay, so these, in a way, that these are like these, what we mean by these realms is that these realms are like external manifestations of inner mental states. And so this correspondence between the inner and the outer. So he went up to the Brahma realms. The Brahma gods said they don't know also, but they said there is this Brahma, the great Brahma, the undefeated, the champion, the universal seer, the wielder of power, the Lord God, the maker, the author, the first, the begetter, the controller, the father of those who have been born and those yet to be born. He is our superior. He might know. So one of my favorite passages in the suttas, and it very nicely captures that tone of pomposity to which religious personages are all too apt to fall into. And worth noting, like the Kevada Sutta is meant to be humorous. And this was one of the tools that the Buddha had in his toolkit about dealing with especially religious arrogance and pomposity. He would just be a little bit of satire and a little bit of taking them down a notch. And sometimes this is much more effective than trying to engage in rational conversation. Okay. So, but we don't know where Brahma is or what way he lies, but by the signs that are seen, light arising and radiance appearing, we know that Brahma will appear, for this is the precursor for the appearance of Brahma, namely light arising and radiance appearing. And so the word precursor here is the Pubba Nimitta, or the Nimitta. And so this is one of the early references in the sutras to the idea of the Nimitta being the arising of a light. Not long afterwards, the great Brahma appeared. Then that mendicant approached the great Brahma and said to him, "Reverend, where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over?" And the great Brahma said to him, "I am Brahma, the great Brahma, the undefeated, the champion, the universal seer, the wielder of power, the Lord God, the maker, the author, the first, the begetter, the controller, the father of those that have been born and those yet to be born." For a second time, the mendicant said to the great Brahma, "Reverend, I am not asking you whether you are Brahma, the great Brahma, the undefeated, the champion, the universal seer, and so on. I'm asking where these primary elements cease without anything left over." Good interrogation technique being demonstrated here, okay? Bear this in mind. I have used this myself. I used this not long ago. When talking with people who are pricked up by arrogance and pomposity in positions of power, such as such as our former environment minister. And I asked him, Greg, in Australia, one of the nice things about living in Australia is we can call our politicians by their first name. They actually designed our Parliament House in Canberra so that it's kind of flat and underground and it has grass on the roof. And it was specifically designed that way so that the citizens can walk on top of the politicians. Yeah? And so this is one of the great things about living in Australia. Anyway, so yeah, when you talk to the politicians in Australia, they'll always say, "Oh yeah, call me Greg." So I say, "Okay, Greg." So I'm like, "Okay, Greg." I said, what's the conversation in the Liberal Party? He belongs to the party here, which we call the Liberal Party, which is in fact the Conservative Party, just in case you're wondering. And I said, "What's the conversation in the Liberal Party about climate change?" And he said, "I think about these things every day." I said to him, "Greg, I didn't ask you what you're thinking about. I asked what the conversation in the Liberal Party is about climate change." And then he didn't answer me. So that's the official answer from the Environment Minister. I then asked another minister from the same party, Ken Wyatt, who was an Indigenous minister from the Liberal Party. I said, Ken, what's the conversation in the Liberal Party about climate change? And he said, none. He said, nobody's talking about it. I said, thank you for giving me a straight answer. That was a number of years ago, but recently a spokesman from the UN said that Australia is the only developed nation where neither of the major political parties has any coherent plan to address climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. So nothing much has changed there. Anywho, I just mentioned that especially for my American friends, because I know that sometimes in America that you can feel that, you know, it's such a mess and that everything's so messed up, and just to know that, you know, you're not alone, that we can be just as messed up as you. I don't know if just as messed up, at least we're trying, okay? I don't know if we can really compete, but we're doing our best down here, down under. All right, moving along. Good technique. Be clear about the question you answer and don't be fobbed off. So Brahma keeps on trying to fob him off for a second time. I'm Brahma. For a third time, I'm Brahma. I'm not asking you whether you're Brahma. I'm asking where these four primary elements cease without anything left over. Then the great Brahma took that mendicant by the arm, led him off to one side and said to him, Mendicant, these gods think that there's nothing at all that I don't know and see and understand and realize. That's why I didn't answer in front of them. But I too do not know where these four primary elements cease with nothing left over. Therefore, mendicant, the misdeed is yours alone. The mistake is yours alone in that you passed over the Buddha and searched elsewhere for an answer to this question. Mendicant, go to the Buddha and ask him this question. You should remember it in line with his answer. So this is, again, corresponding with this Buddhist theory of cosmology. The great Brahma attained his position by developing the first jhana, got into that position. So that's what he knows. And he doesn't know what lies above him, and especially the four formless attainments. So the monk returns to the Buddha, bows, sits to one side, and of course the Brahma is a partisan of the Buddha in the Buddhist suttas. Where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of water, earth, water, fire, air? And when he said this, I said to him, the Buddha now speaking in first person, once upon a time, mendicants and sea merchants set sail for the ocean deeps, taking with them a land-spotting bird. When their ship was out of sight, they released the bird. It flew away to the east, the west, the north, the south, upwards and between. And if it saw land, it went there and stayed. But if it saw no land, it returned to the ship. In the same way, after failing to get an answer to this question, even after searching as far as the Brahma realm, you have returned to me. Mendicant, this is not how the question should be asked. Again, good technique, and good to know, good to observe how the Buddha approached these things. Sometimes the Buddha would give a straight answer. Sometimes he would say, we should rephrase this question. Where do these four primary elements cease without anything left over, namely the elements of earth, water, fire, and air? Instead, this is how the question should be asked. And he then goes on to ask, to give the verses which form the climax of the sutta. And I'm aware that I'm running out of time. Having said that, I'm not going to use up this much time, but anyway. Where do water and earth, fire and air find no footing? Where do long and short, fine and coarse, beautiful and ugly? Where do name and form cease with nothing left over? And the answer to that is consciousness that's invisible, infinite, entirely given up. That's where water and earth, fire and air find no footing. And that's where long and short, fine and coarse, beautiful and ugly, that's when name and form cease with nothing left over. With the cessation of consciousness, that's where this ceases. That's what the Buddha said, and the household at Kevadha was satisfied with what the Buddha said. Now, I'll just make a few remarks on these verses, and then we'll go over to questions. And I don't want to solve all of the problems with understanding these verses. These verses are some of the most commented on lines in the Pali Canon. And every scholar and practitioner has an essay or an article or an opinion about these. And I remember many years ago, I asked my friend Venerable Analayo, I said, have you looked into this one? And he just wrote back and said, oh, actually, it was when he'd done his first essay he was doing these essays on the Majjhima Nikaya. And I noticed that there's a similar line in the Majjhima Nikaya, and he had not really said much about it in his essay. He just sort of passed over it a bit. And I just wrote to him and said, oh, look, is there anything more on that? And he wrote back and said, to be honest, I've had so many conversations with people about this, and which have gone round and round in circles, that I just got kind of bored of that question, and I just sort of gave up. trying to write something on it. So then he sort of went back and did some more, and he's since done some more work on that. So everybody has a theory and everyone has an opinion. And I can just share you my opinion based on my work and my research, and especially based on as a translator and looking at how to translate this particular passage. One thing that we notice when we're translating it is that we have a pair of verses which give a question and an answer. In the first verse, which posits the question, we have a series of questions, okay? And then in the answer, we have a series of answers. Now, in the Pali canon, the Pali idiom, when this happens, we find two kinds of situations. In one kind of situation, the first series of questions are more or less synonyms. Right? The questioner is repeating the same question for emphasis. And then the Buddha responds, giving essentially one answer to a series of questions. In another kind of questions, the question is asking a distinctly different series of questions, and the Buddha will give a distinctly different series of answers. Right? So both of those forms we find in the suttas. And this particular one, I think maybe a mixture of both of those, but I think that there are a couple of distinct questions perhaps being asked and distinct answers being given. That's one thing to notice. Okay, so where do earth, water, and as I mentioned before, from the context, it seems to me that the narrative context is hinting that the direct answer, so why did the Buddha not want to answer the question? So it seems to me that the narrative context is hinting that the direct answer to that monk's question is to say the four formless attainments which lie beyond the four jhanas. The monk that attained jhanas, he's looking, well, what's next? Where do these elements cease? And that's the formless jhana. That's what he was looking for. The Buddha said, no, that's not the question you should be asking, because the goal of Buddha's practice is not the formless attainments. The goal of Buddha's practice is enlightenment and the realization of nibbana. And that's why the Buddha phrased the question to reframe it in terms of leading to nibbana and not just formless attainments. Again, this is my interpretation of that narrative structure of the sutta. Where do water, earth, fire, and air find no footing? Long and short, fine and coarse, beautiful and ugly. So all of these things are aspects of the material and manifest world. Beauty, length, dimension, all of these things. And these are things which can be said to have some relevance in the context of the form jhanas, but which are not relevant in the context of the formless jhanas, and of course, not in nibbana. Then the famous passage, the Buddha says, Vinyanang anidasanang anantang sabato babang. And so finally, Wang Mo, I apologize for taking more than an hour to get around to answering your actual question. Of course, I don't have time to answer your question now. But anyway, very briefly. And again, I'm doing this quite deliberately, because what I'm trying to do is trying to share with you some insight and some methods for developing the techniques for learning to read suttas in context, so that you can learn to read them with a bit more nuance and understanding and find the answers that matter to you. Right. But okay, so Vijnana and Nidasana, Vijnana, consciousness, one of the five aggregates. And of course, according to the Buddha, that all the five aggregates are impermanent, they're suffering, they are not self, they're conditioned, they will pass away, and they are not the goal of practice. And this is one of the key differences between the Buddha's teachings and the teachings of the Upanishads. Now, remember here that this whole context, the monk was going up and seeking Brahma. The Brahma who's practicing these jhanas, and the Brahmas who were the rishis and the meditators, were those from the Upanishads, right? So following that lineage of the Upanishads, which first appeared in India a couple of hundred years before the Buddha. And in those teachings, in the Upanishadic teachings, especially in the teachings of Yajnavalkya, the greatest sage of the Upanishads, he talked about the Vijnana Ganameva. He said that this higher self, this self is not anything that you can see. It is not these four elements. It is not your senses. It is not any of the things of this manifest world that you take to be who you are. This is not yourself. But what is yourself is Vijnana Ganameva, that sheer mass of consciousness. So this is the teaching which was prevalent in ancient India at the highest level of the sages and philosophers before the Buddha appeared on the scene. So the Buddha is talking about consciousness which is non-manifest, anidasana. So the word anidasana means something that can show or that can appear, something that can manifest, something that's visible. What does it mean to say consciousness is invisible? I believe that this is referring to another passage that we find in the suttas where the consciousness of an arahant, an enlightened person who's meditating, can't be discerned by anybody outside. So even those who maybe can read minds and know what people's consciousness are, they don't know what the consciousness of an enlightened being is. And there's a number of passages in the suttas that refer to this. And I believe that that's what this means here, that the anidasana vijnana means consciousness of an arahant, which those who are not enlightened can't comprehend or can't grasp. Infinite, without end or without measure, and then the word sabatopa bhang. Now, sabatopa bhang is a problematic phrase and subject to many different interpretations. The most common interpretation is that it is sabato in every way, but bhang, radiant, and most of the translations you will find will have that. However, there are variant readings which have sabato bahang, which means every way given up. And we find different explanations for this both in the Pali tradition and also in the Chinese and Tibetan and other traditions as well. So it seems as if it's, I won't go into all of the details, and Alio has studied this, but it's not entirely clear what the reading is. Now, in my translation on sort of Central at the moment, I translated it as entirely given up. I've had some conversations with some other monks about this. Actually, recently had a conversation with Venerable Sudaso of the Empty Cloud Monastery in New York. And, you know, back and forth, it still goes. And I'm not sure, you know, to be honest. So I've translated, I think it's most likely to mean sabato bahang, but I'm not sort of dogmatic about that in any way. One of the things as a matter of interpretation that we should bear in mind here is that it is unwise to render our interpretation of the Dhamma based on the presence or absence of a single letter. That's what we're talking about here, a word, the one letter that might be spelled one way or might be spelled another way. The Buddha was more clear than that. He spelled out the things that mattered to him very often. And especially in this particular place, we're talking about a narrative context that is highly determined, right? This is a very specific and focused narrative talking about a specific set of issues. This is not like a general Dhamma teaching. It's not like when the Buddha taught the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra and he taught the Four Noble Truths. It's like a general teaching that everyone can apply. This is a very specific and very personal and particular teaching at a particular time, highly determined by the narrative context. And the fact that it is highly determined is confirmed by the fact that when a verse similar to this also appears elsewhere in the suttas, in Majjhima number 49, the Brahmani Mantanika Sutta, it's a similar context. Right? The narrative context is similar. So clearly this is being taught in a particular way at this time and this place. And so when we find a word which is of unclear reading and of unclear meaning and interpretation, which is moreover in a verse, right? And verse in Pali is always harder to parse, harder to understand than the prose is. So one of the things that I find is that often people will like to draw heavy and strong conclusions from dubious passages. And this is a sign of a lack of wisdom in reading and interpreting suttas. And this was a piece of advice that Venerable Nyanaponika gave to Ajahn Brahm many years ago, the great German monk who's the Ajahn Bhikkhu Bodhi's teacher. And Nyanaponika said that we should not interpret the Dhamma based on occasional and one-off passages, but we should look at it in terms of the overall framework of the things that the Buddha taught again and again and again, and which he clearly believed to be the central teachings. And then we can read the minor and incidental passages in that light. And that comes back to the point that I made at the beginning, that we should read scriptures in a compassionate way. Think about how you would like to be understood. If you are a teacher, or if you are somebody who works in a particular field or has opinions about something, would you like your entire teaching and understanding to be reduced to a one-off remark that you made when talking with a particular student? Or would you think, no, it's actually those things which are on the curriculum, which I teach every day, these are the things that are most important. So what exactly does Sabatopa Bang mean? I don't know 100%. I suspect it means entirely given up, but it may also mean radiant in every way, because this is a word that the Buddha used sometimes to describe the mind which is in samadhi. So name and form cease with nothing left over. So then he goes on to conclude the verse by saying, with the cessation of consciousness, that's where all this ceases. So vijnanasa nirodhena. And of course, independent origination in the context of the 5 aggregates and in the 6 senses. And whenever the Buddha is talking about consciousness, he always points to that Nibbana is the cessation of consciousness. And this is one of the deepest and most challenging teachings in the whole of the Buddha taught. And it's that one point where he stepped beyond what the Upanishadic masters had taught, and where he said, even that thing which is consciousness, even that thing which is most subtle, most hard to see, even that thing which is most refined, the Buddha said that consciousness is the lord of the city, sitting in the middle at the crossroads. Even that comes to an end. And so this is a very profound and very challenging teaching that the Buddha gave. And so he wraps this up by emphasizing once more this central message which he has taught so many times. So this reaches the end of the sutta. I do apologize for going over time. I've gone probably on way too many digressions. Anyway, what can I say? It's a fun sutta. Do we have time for chats and stuff?
We do, Bante. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Richard, because he's probably got a few questions, maybe starting off with his own question, which inspired one of the reasons why we asked you this theme.
So Bante, there's an elephant in the room, obviously, which is the role of jhana meditation in the modern presentation of Buddhist thought.
Okay.
Because, I'm very struck by how central jhana meditation is in the way the Buddha taught. But there are 2 enigmas. One is, of course, he went beyond jhana meditation himself. That is the story of his search for enlightenment. So what happened to take him beyond it? And secondly, why is vipassana so stressed now when it appears to have very little role, as I can find, in what the Buddha said at the time in the sutta? So what is the essence here we're trying to understand? Why have jhana at all? What's it good for? And, what's beyond it, and how do you go beyond it having achieved it? What's the point of achieving it if you're going to go beyond it? It's a very enigmatic issue, this.
Yeah, we got what, a couple of minutes for this one? Yeah. Okay, I will do my best. And like I said, I'm not here to solve all of these problems and so on, but hopefully we can clarify a few issues. So the first issue, so you're asking, like, the Buddha practiced jhana and then went beyond it, right?
Yes.
So again, to me, you look at that in terms of the narrative framework, all right? Again, one of the things that I'm trying to convey is try to look at the suttas. The suttas always begin, thus have I heard, at one time the Buddha was staying here. They're a particular teaching at a particular time and place. And that context that they're in, we always need to bear that in mind. So the context there is that the Buddha had left his home seeking on what he called the noble search. He's seeking for an end to birth, aging, and death. And his experience with his former teachers under the Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta is explicitly what it says in the text, is that these teachings do not lead to the ending of birth, aging, and death. That's why he wasn't satisfied with them. And so he kept on going until he found that thing that he was looking for. And that's what really drove him, because, experience of jhanas is super powerful, and these deep states of meditation. I mean, without going into sort of another battle about what jhanas are and things like that, but a lot of meditators have powerful experiences if you go on a long retreat or something like that. And it's very tempting to say, well, this is enlightenment. And, you know, very reasonable to say that, yeah, because it's an overwhelmingly powerful experience. And this is one of the, one of the features of the determination of the Buddha, that he wasn't satisfied with that and he kept going. He said, no, this actually is still conditioned. This is something which is still shaped, this process has led me here, and that process has shaped this experience. And so we keep on going. Yeah? So I think that's the first question. The second question you asked, well, what is good for? See, the other thing about jhanas is that jhanas are all about letting go, right? So this is the thing, is that jhanas are not something which is incidental, that just happened to be like a kind of a separate thing that you do before you do the real thing. The Buddha talked about the anupubbha nirodha, that this sort of ends with the cessation of consciousness. But the anupubbha nirodha, the gradual cessation, is the progress through the 4 jhanas and even the formless jhanas, because at each stage you're letting go of something. You're letting go of your attachment to the senses. You're letting go of the coarser activities of mind, letting go of the hindrances. You're letting go of thought. You're letting go even of the rapture and the bliss in the jhana itself. And you're letting go more and more and more. And so the nibbana is, in one way, is an outcome of that process. Keep on going until you let go of everything. Second question that you asked, I don't know if that answers your question satisfactorily. But
I want to know, because in many ways it makes it very enigmatic, because in a sense that the formless jhana is the ultimate letting go. Eventually you let go of perception and non-perception.
Right.
Let go of everything. And yet you're saying that's not let gone enough.
That is
something else you've got to let go
of. Right, exactly, yeah.
So when the Buddha turns away from his teachers, he does so saying, this doesn't lead to liberation.
Yeah. That's right. But he also, when he did become enlightened, his first thought was to say, actually, those guys were really close.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to go and teach them. And then, but they'd already passed away. Yeah.
So is there a reference to what was still being held on to? Is it the asura?
Absolutely, because in that very phrase, he says these states only lead to rebirth in that realm of neither perception nor non-perception. Yeah, Yava Deva, if I can remember the Pali, Yava Deva, Neva Sanya Na Sanya Yatanam, Upasampajja Viharati. I can't remember. Anyway, whatever. Exact phrase, but they only lead to rebirth in that realm. So as we mentioned a bit earlier, that in the Buddhist cosmology, that the states of rebirth, the dimensions, are like dimensions into which consciousness is projected, which are formed by how we use our mind in this life. And if we use our mind in that very skillful way to develop these deep states of meditation, then our mind will be projected into a realm that corresponds with those states of meditation. And that's what we mean when we talk about the Brahma realms and so on. So you would get reborn in that state, which would last for a very long time, tens of thousands of eons, according to the Buddhist tradition. That means like tens of thousands of universes. Big bangs, right? Well, the whole Big Bang happens, goes up and down tens of thousands of times while you're just sitting there chilling out in your formless realm, right? That's a long time, and that's very stable. And again, most people would think, well, that's eternal. But the Buddha's like, no, actually, it's still conditioned and it's still impermanent. Yeah.
But is there any reference anywhere in the suttas to what lies beyond that state? I mean, it's a very big theme in the Mahayana. There are very specific teachings about this, as you're doubtless aware, like the famous dialogue between Gampopa and Milarepa on this very point.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm not sure, are there references in the Pali as well to anything other than these rather enigmatic lines? It may not mean this at all, but so what does lie beyond perception and non-perception?
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, there are some, as you say, quite enigmatic states of samadhi which are talked about in the suttas, and of course, it's always really hard to describe these things in a textual basis. And usually, what we have in the suttas is just a few lines. But yes, there's a state they call the cessation of perception of consciousness, which lies beyond the 4 jhanas. There's other meditations which appear to be like meditations practiced by the arahants, which also may be a bit different. According to the Theravada tradition, they're regarded as a phala samapatti, a fruition attainment. There are other things also mentioned, like there's the formless, the emptiness meditation, the meditation on signlessness, emptiness, and non-direction or non-desire. So these are mentioned, and there are some interesting things talked about in the suttas about that. So, but all of those states, in a sense, go beyond. They don't go beyond the neither perception nor non-perception as a pure samadhi state. So neither perception nor non-perception is the most stable state of pure samadhi. And what those other states are is where that wisdom dimension is coming in, and where there is some kind of emergence of a letting go at a more profound level, like a fundamental existential level of letting go of defilements, rather than merely suppressing them or temporary letting go of defilements. So it's Theravada tradition. I'm not sure what the Northern traditions say about this, but the Theravada tradition says that if you enter the cessation of perception and feeling, then when you emerge from it, then you must be at least a non-returner or an arahant. But then neither perception nor non-perception is like the highest realm in terms of a dimension of rebirth. And Ananda one time says to the Buddha, it seems to me, Bhante, that if you're going to get attached to anything, then that's kind of the best place to get attached to. And the Buddha says, yeah, you're probably right. If you're going to get attached to anything, might as well get attached to neither perception nor non-perception.
Thank you, Bhante. As I say, that there's a reference to awakened clarity that you see in that, that's the essence of the Gampopa Milarepa discussion. Right. Gampopa boasting on being in non-perception and being in neither perception nor non-perception.
Right.
And Milarepa says you're going to be reborn as a formless God. Lucky you met me, because I have awakened clarity, which is beyond that state.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that would be a similar dialogue. Yeah. I mean, I can't really say too much. I'm not familiar with that dialogue, but it sounds very similar to that distinction. There is a difference between attaining profound states of meditation and attaining realization. Yeah. Right. And I think that, I think that is one of the fundamental principles. I think you find that in all the different schools of Buddhism.
Right. Okay. So
go on.
There's a question from the audience here. How does consciousness pass from one life?
Sorry, Richard. Are we going to do the Vipassana question, which we haven't addressed?
Oh, yes, please do the Vipassana question, Bhante. I don't want to dominate the discussion, but I'd love to hear.
This is surely not going to be controversial at all. So, Bishop John Shelby Spong, who is the Bishop of Episcopalian Bishop of Newark, said that religion will die of boredom long before it dies of controversy. So, okay, so I actually wrote a book on that very topic that you wrote. I wrote a book called A History of Mindfulness many years ago, which is long and boring and complicated, so you probably shouldn't read it, but I'll just give you the summary. So you mentioned about how Vipassana meditation is not found in the suttas all that much. And that's kind of true and not true at the same time. So this is both real and not real. Anyway, it's true that the Buddha didn't explicitly teach a method of Vipassana meditation, nor did he teach a method of samatha meditation. Right? You never find the Buddha saying, here's how you do samatha, here's how you do Vipassana, this is a method for doing samatha, this is a method for doing Vipassana. You don't find that at all. Samatha and Vipassana in the suttas are qualities of mind. Samatha is a quality of serenity and tranquility of mind. Vipassana is a quality of insight and discernment of mind. And meditation is practiced in order to develop these qualities of mind. So all of the kinds of meditation that we do are there in order to develop these things. So these are not like schools of meditation or classes of meditation techniques. They're qualities through which we are supposed to practice to develop meditation. So in the later tradition, then it became much more that we're going to classify different meditations under one or other of these headings. And so in the suttas, what you find is that there are, for example, a lot of wisdom teachings, especially in the Samyutta Nikaya and especially in the great wisdom collections in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Nidana Samyutta, the Kanda Samyutta, the Salayatana Samyutta, the Dhatu Samyutta. In all of these places, we constantly find the Buddha referring to understanding the five aggregates with wisdom, understanding that they're impermanent, understanding that they're conditioned. And this obviously is what Vipassana meditation is all about. So yes, the Buddha was teaching Vipassana meditation all through the suttas, but he wasn't calling it a Vipassana meditation technique. Now, this is purely a difference in nomenclature, and it's not in itself, it's not meaningful, right? Who cares, right? People use words to describe things. It doesn't really matter. But it's the inference that you use for it. One of the things that I found in my book, History of Mindfulness, is that one of the distinctively different things you find in modern times is that Vipassana is equated and very closely related to mindfulness practice. And what I found in my research is that this is not the case in the suttas, that there is no specific relationship between mindfulness and Vipassana in the suttas. In fact, in all of those great wisdom collections, all of the hundreds upon hundreds of suttas where the Buddha was teaching about developing meditation through seeing impermanence and so on, mindfulness is never mentioned once. Mindfulness is never mentioned in the Khandha Samyutta. It's never mentioned in the Salayatana Samyutta. And may be referred to incidentally once or twice, but basically it's never mentioned in any of those places. And the idea that mindfulness is closely related to Vipassana meditation is specifically an outcome of the history of the textual redaction of the Pali version of the Satipatthana Sutta. Now, Satipatthana Sutta exists in multiple recensions. There's a number of Chinese versions. There's texts and references throughout Sanskrit and Tibetan texts and so on. And if you take, as well as in the Pali Abhidhamma, which is one of the most interesting ones, but in all of those versions, you see that, yes, there is some relation between the practice of mindfulness and the practice of Vipassana, but it's not the main focus. The main focus is that mindfulness leads to samadhi, and samadhi leads to wisdom. And that's what mindfulness is for. Mindfulness essentially means, in the suttas, means meditation, as in watching your breath to make your mind peaceful. And so then you can see it. So obviously it's not separate from Vipassana. It's not like it's a different thing, but the emphasis and the balance is different. So in the suttas, the emphasis is that it's mostly about that process of making your mind peaceful, from which wisdom emerges. Now, why that shift has changed historically in modern times is a complex historical process to do with the sociology and the history of Buddhism in the modern realm. Very briefly, in most of the Theravadan traditions, the practice of meditation had mostly fallen into abeyance. We know little about the history of meditation in Theravada before the late 19th century, and there is little evidence that meditation was in fact being practiced at all. Now, it may have been, and there may have been different oral traditions. And I remember talking with yourself, Richard, and Wangbo about how, I remember, Richard, I think you said that the Theravada was the only true Buddhist esoteric tradition. And that in Tibetan Buddhism, everything's written down and all the esoteric traditions are written down, whereas in Pali traditions, there's a lot of things found in all of these monasteries and traditions locally all over the place, which are truly just local oral traditions passed down. And there are many wild and wacky meditation practices found all over the place. And, that we don't hear about in the West, because everything we hear about is filtered through the Theravada filter, that everything, according to official orthodoxy in Theravada, we have to make everything boring, we have to package everything in brown, and we have to eliminate any joy or life before we can say that it's Theravada. But of course, that's not how Theravadans live in Theravadan countries. In fact, it's very diverse. It's very creative, and there are all kinds of monks teaching very innovative approaches. And, I'm most familiar with the Thai scene, and, there are people doing all of these kinds of things, it's funny kind of movements and hand mudras and all of these kinds of methods. So when I say that we don't have evidence for Theravadan meditation earlier than the late 19th century, it doesn't mean there was nothing happening, but we don't really know what that was. and it would really be a, more, there's been some anthropological research on that, but obviously much more is needed. Anyhow, so then, of course, what happens, right? Then, of course, the bad thing happens. By bad thing, I mean the English. And the English went over and they invaded India, and they invaded Myanmar, and they invaded Sri Lanka, and of course, not just the Indians, but the Dutch and everybody else as well. And what we call colonialism. And colonialism has had a massive impact on the whole history of Buddhism since then. What colonialists typically do, they arrive in a country and they think, we're better than you. What you have is rubbish. What we have is great. That means that we have the God-given right to take all of your stuff and bring it back to our country and be rich because of it. And one of the things that they do is that they tend to devalue and criticize the local religions, including Buddhism. And so they're like, what are you doing? This is just idol worship. This is just nonsense. This is just superstition. This is just black magic. And to be fair, they had a point, because there was actually a lot of that stuff, and still is, going on in Buddhist countries. And there is a lot of superstition, and there is a lot of ignorance, and there is a lot of people who don't really understand what the Buddha was teaching. Not to say everybody's like that, but it is a reality in all the Buddhist traditions. So then the Buddhists start to say, well, look, that's not what our tradition is. That's not the real meaning of our tradition. Here is what our tradition is. And they point to the Buddhist philosophy. They point to the Buddhist meditation. They point to the rational psychology. They start to draw out the actual wisdom teachings of the Buddha. And this is what we call Buddhist modernism, which emerged across the Buddhist world in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Buddhist modernism took different forms in different places. But in Burma in particular, it was driven by the teachings originally of Ledi Sayadaw, and then later by others such as Mahasi Sayadaw. They wanted to rescue meditation and show that meditation is a rational practice, right? That meditation is not a mystical communion, that it's a rational practice based on a scientific psychology. And that's explicitly how they presented their meditation. And remember that, Ledi Sayadaw was in correspondence with Carolyn Rees Davids in London, right? He wrote letters to her, and he addressed her as the Landana Pali Devi, the Pali angel of London. Right? So these people were not isolated from, what was happening in the West. Freud at that time had a Buddha image in his office. He knew about these things, but he criticized meditation, and Freud wrote of meditation as being like a kind of regression to the womb, an immersion in an oceanic womb-like experience, and he saw it as an infantile state, and he thought that that's what the Buddhists were doing. And so these people were protesting against this, and they were coming and saying, no, it's about understanding your mind. It's about clarity. It's an analytical and a critical approach to meditation. And so they emphasize these things, both as a response to colonialism and also as a response to the superstitious and magical practices which were prevalent in their own. So in a sense, it's kind of acknowledging that there was something valid in those colonial criticisms, right? And that from those practices is where we get the modern Vipassana movement and the modern Vipassana practice. And they're emphasizing that aspect of practice because it was culturally necessary at that time and that place. And this is the thing that we often forget, that these things have a context. So then, and to me, that is a really valuable movement. The problem though, is that Western people come along and say, oh, this meditation that they're doing, that's just like our psychology. And you go, well, yes, of course it is, because it was developed in dialogue with your psychology. It's just as psychology was developed in dialogue with Buddhism. And these things have been aware of each other. And they're like, oh, this is rational and scientific. We're rational and scientific. So that must be what Buddhist meditation is. Whereas in fact, perhaps from the West, need a different approach and a different emphasis. And one of our problems, and our great problems, has been a lack of emotional wholeness and a lack of a sense of meaning and value as individuals and as people. because we live in a world which is constantly changing, which is very fractured. And to be honest, I shouldn't even say West in this case. I think that that's a very outdated way of talking about it. It's actually just modernity, because it's the same these days everywhere you go in the world. It doesn't really matter what country you're in. We experience fracture. We experience this everything's exploding at the same time. We experience anxiety, depression. All of these things are emotional conflicts and emotional issues that we have to address. And that is where samatha excels, in finding a sense of wholeness and peace within ourselves. And when we have that sense of wholeness and peace within ourselves, then we're ready to accept the hard truths that Vipassana might teach us. So that's my understanding of the historical context and the progression, and why the Vipassana movement emerged, and why it is evolving and changing today. And I think it's certainly evolved, in the last few decades that I've been around. And we've seen a softening of some of the more hardcore attitudes you might have had in the past, and a more acceptance of the role of samatha and jhana meditation and so on. And so I think that's been moving in a wholesome direction in the past couple of decades.
Thank you, Bhante. My last point here, question to you, is very short. Is there a sutta anywhere where jhanas lead to insight directly, rather than, you have insights, you have jhanas, but is there sort of where the Buddha says, okay, you do these jhanas, then insight arises, or some sort of reference like that?
That's I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for, but that's like all the way through the gradual training. You do the 4 jhanas, and then you develop the higher knowledges, which are the insights, and then that you end up with enlightenment. So that's like the basic framework. I'm not sure if you're looking for anything more specific than that.
Well, no, but are the higher knowledges a fruit of the jhanas, or are they a separate practice? I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yes, the sort of the Lokiya abhinya, right? The worldly abhinyas are, yes, but not the vision of the 4 Noble Truths. So the vision of which is also one part of the abhinyas.
But that's a fruit or practice?
Sorry?
Is that a fruit of the jhana, or is it a practice after the jhana?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
It's which? Sorry, I didn't catch.
Sorry, I misheard your questions.
Is it a fruit? Is it a fruit of the jhana meditation, or is it something you do after you have done the jhana meditations?
Okay, yeah, okay. I see what you're getting at, yeah. Okay, so there's another sutta in the Digha Nikaya that talks about that, and it says that somebody criticizes the Buddhist monks, the Samana Sakyaputtiya, because they indulge in sensual pleasures, okay? And they're very indulgent. And that was really meant as a critique from like a Jain point of view, because the Jains are always very hardcore, and they thought that we were luxurious and backsliding. And maybe they have a point there, I don't know. But and the Buddha said, yes, you're right. The Buddhist monks, my followers, do in fact indulge in pleasure, and they indulge in 4 kinds of pleasure: the pleasure of the 1st jhana, the 2nd jhana, the 3rd jhana, and the 4th jhana. And when they indulge in those 4 kinds of pleasure, they get 4 kinds of fruition: stream entry, once return, non-return, and arahant. So this is one of the, one of those contexts, and we find that very commonly, that the Buddha says that, develop samadhi. A monk who develops samadhi will see things how they really are, and they will see the 4 Noble Truths or the 5 aggregates and so on. But I think the point that you're getting to there is whether there's like a separate and distinct kind of meditation practice that you do after jhanas, or do you just get in the jhanas and then bingo, you grab the truth? Is this what you're getting at, Richard? Yeah. Yes. Okay. So the answer to that is it depends. And I think this is why this is not put explicitly in those general contexts, because it depends on the individual. So every individual has to have some wisdom. You have to have right view. You have to have some understanding of the Buddha's teachings and so on. But there's kind of a sliding scale of wisdom. Basically, the wiser that you are, then the quicker that you're going to progress. And somebody who has very strong wisdom maybe get into a jhana, and then when they come out of it, they'll be like, right? It's all impermanent. even that jhana is impermanent. And then boom, they let go and that's it. Yeah? So that process can be very quick for some. And, you know, and this, I'm not even just, you know, I don't even want to just restrict this to examples from scriptures or anything like that, because I think this is actually very realistic. I think people are in a very different place in their meditation practice, and some people will just see these things very quickly. And for other people, no, for other people, they have to laboriously go over it again and again and again and see this is impermanent. This is impermanent. That thing's impermanent. That one's impermanent too. And that one's impermanent. And that one. And sometimes you have to sit there for years contemplating, these senses are impermanent. These conditions are impermanent. These khandhas are impermanent. And little bit by little bit, you're deepening your wisdom. And eventually, then that will fruit as the deep wisdom of realization. So I think that there are these kinds of people. I think that probably most of us are kind of a bit more like the second kind than the first kind. And so we benefit from the deeper that our wisdom will go, then the quicker that our realization will happen.
Thank you, Bhante. There's two other questions very quickly we should ask. One is, how does consciousness pass from one life to another, if indeed it does?
Right. Okay.
Well, we're on the topic.
This is great. I really love these questions because there's no possible way that I can answer them satisfactorily, but that has never stopped me. I don't know what that says about me, but anyway. How does consciousness pass from one lifetime to another? Well, both yes and no. It passes from one life to another in the same sense that a river flows past a town and then flows past another town. I mean, is it the same river? Yeah, kind of. Is it exactly the same in every respect? No. And so consciousness is the same. The Buddha talked about the stream of consciousness, which is established in this lifetime and the next lifetime. And so consciousness is impermanent and changing, and it's impermanent and changing right now. All of your consciousnesses are changing. Your awareness is changing, and it has been since you were born, and it will continue to be so until you die. And there's nothing that you or I can do about that. Even in meditation, where we reach a state of stillness and stability in meditation, it's still changing, albeit much more slowly. So death and rebirth is a process in the changing of consciousness. And so the consciousness which is reborn is not identical with the consciousness you're experiencing now, nor is it completely different. It's conditioned by the consciousness that we're experiencing now. That idea that it's the very same consciousness is what the Buddha criticized in his the Mahatma Sankhya Sutta in response to the fisherman Sati. So I think the question also asked about like the mechanism by which consciousness is reborn. So this isn't the Buddha didn't concern him so much with kind of the mechanism of these things, just as he didn't talk about like what's the mechanism that, like the physical mechanism of consciousness and these kinds of things as well. He was concerned about the experience of it rather than the underlying mechanism. So as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of an open question. I think it's a question that could potentially be scientifically investigated, and I think that would be an interesting thing to do. But I don't think that we have a clear answer from that. I don't think it was what the Buddha was primarily concerned about. Okay, next question, Richard.
A lot of related questions. Can consciousness be considered energy?
Yes.
If so, how can it be ceased? Shouldn't it be just transformed?
Okay, so thank you for asking an easy question at last. Yes, consciousness is a kind of energy. Everything is kind of energy. Everything is kind of sankhara, and everything is conditioned. And in Buddhism, as in the laws of thermodynamics, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed. And so, so when we talk about impermanence, I think this is really important to bear in mind, that impermanence doesn't mean the absolute and final ending of things. It means that things arise in one form, they pass away, and that they condition and something else will arise. But that energy is still, it's still manifesting in one way or another and changing throughout time. How does Nibbana work then? If Nibbana is a cessation without a re-arising of things, how does that work? Well, all we can really say is Nibbana breaks the second law of thermodynamics. Bingo. Yeah, I mean, the second law of thermodynamics, of course, is talking about physical phenomena, but still, if we apply that to mental phenomena, it's the same thing. And of course, one thing to bear in mind about physical laws is that physical laws of physics are, according to Buddhism, what we call upadaya panyati. And Richard, I'm not sure if this is the same in Tibetan philosophy, but from Theravada philosophy, we regard these kinds of laws, physical laws, or even laws of the Dhamma, like Four Noble Truths or something, as being upadaya panyati, that it means to say that they are derived, literally means a derived description, or that they're a generalization or an inference about things, so that the laws of physics don't make things happen, right? So the laws of physics aren't sort of sitting out there like a policeman telling this pen that you have to fall down, right? Laws of physics describe what we see when we observe pens falling, and they make a generalization based on that. And so any generalization, as powerful as the laws of physics are, they are generalizations which arise from observations within a certain context. And even within physics itself, there are a number, when you step beyond the normal observable realm, then there are a number of contexts where it seems like these generalizations may no longer apply. If you go into a black hole, for example, or if you talk about the Big Bang and various of these kinds of exotic phenomena, where in some scenarios, perhaps some of these laws might not apply in the same way that they are here. That doesn't mean that physics is wrong. It just means that it is a limited description based on the observation of what we can see. So Buddhism would say essentially that the same thing, that in terms of our limited observation of the empirical realm, that yes, energy is neither created nor destroyed. But Nibbana is not that same empirical realm that we're talking about here. And that is where those questions fail. And the Buddha would say, look, you can't push questioning that far. This is where all of those things that we know about our empirical world no longer apply. Na upedi sankang.
Thank you, Bhante. Then there's a very related question here. It says, I recall in one sutta, the Buddha referred to Nibbana as consciousness without surface. Could you comment?
Yeah, I think that's a mistranslation. It's probably the same passage that we're talking about here, but the translation without surface is a bit of a mistranslation. The Pali word is anidasana. The word dasana means to see or to be visible. Nidasana means to appear or to manifest or to make visible or show. For example, somebody talks about an example of, like, let's say I was able to draw a picture on a canvas, and I was able to make manifest an image of a man or a woman on this canvas. So it's this idea that you can make something visible, or more generally, not necessarily physically visible, but more generally manifest in a way that is knowable and apparent to the mind. This is what nidasana means. So to translate it as without surface, I think it's not, you can see that there's a sort of a connection of meaning there, right? It's not completely wrong, but to me, it's a bit of a misleading translation. The actual word is, the literal meaning of it is invisible.
Right, thank you, Bhante. And there's one final question, and this is about the difference between jhana and samadhi.
Okay.
I'm slightly confused. The question is, does jhana get developed after samadhi?
Okay.
But just what
okay.
you talk about that.
All right, so in the suttas, mostly jhana and samadhi are synonyms. So they're used in slightly different contexts sometimes, but they're basically referring to the same thing. And in 99% of cases, that's true. There are occasional cases where the word samadhi is used in a slightly broader context than jhanas, where, for example, some of these cases we talked about earlier, where there are these more kind of exotic states of realization, like perhaps a meditation that an arahant practices or something like that, that are referred to as samadhi, but don't fall within the scheme of the four jhanas. But most of the time, In the ordinary kind of language, jhana and samadhi are synonyms. So this is why in my recent translations, I translate jhana as absorption and samadhi as immersion. And I did that deliberately because these are two words that have a similar meaning in English. So I want to try to convey that.
So in the Noble Eightfold Path,
yeah,
where you have right mindfulness, right samadhi, is that reference this broader idea then? Would that be right?
No, right samadhi in the Eightfold Path is just jhanas, basically.
But that is just the jhanas.
Yeah.
Because it seems like slightly confusing that that's meant to lead to liberation.
Right.
But it's just the jhanas, it doesn't. That's the point.
Well, it does if you've got right view.
Oh, okay, I see. So I see.
Again, the importance of context, right?
Yes, yes.
So right view in the Eightfold Path is the wisdom factor. And at a minimum, it means having an idea of what the Dhamma is, right? Having some understanding of impermanence and so on. And that informs the entire practice of the Eightfold Path, so that any of the factors that you're practicing in the Eightfold Path are not right if they're not informed by right view. So if you don't have right view, then you can speak and I can say, well, it's Sunday today, which it's Saturday where you are, isn't it right? Anyway, it's Sunday here in Australia. And that means I'm not lying, but it's not right speech, okay? Unless I'm saying it in the context of the Noble Eightfold Path as a whole. And the same thing with right samadhi, right? Right samadhi isn't a kind of different meaning of the word samadhi. Samadhi is the same, just as mindfulness is the same, whether it's right or not, it's just mindfulness. But it's right because it's informed by right view. And we have that idea of the Dhamma with the right view, and that deepens, and the wisdom deepens through practice of the path. And then with right samadhi, it fruits, and that view becomes an insight, becomes an understanding, depending on, as I mentioned before, our faculty of wisdom. So the deeper our faculty of wisdom, then the easier that will happen. But if our faculty of wisdom is not so deep yet, then we have to do more practice to deepen that through vipassana meditation.
So could right view be some vipassana? Could it be called vipassana?
No.
It couldn't.
No. It can divide, in Theravada, we divide wisdom into three main portions. First one is the theoretical knowledge, right, which is the beginning of the path. That's having the right opinion. So that's what we can gain by listening to Dhamma talks and so on, and also reflecting on Dhamma. Then you have the wisdom of, what do they call it? The tirana parinya, the wisdom that arrives from experiential practice. So this is a vipassana meditation. It's where you're taking those teachings and you're putting them into practice. And then finally, you have the pahana parinya, which is the wisdom of letting go. And that is what emerges from those things. So when people refer to vipassana meditation, again, remembering that the Buddha didn't talk about it in this way. When they're talking about vipassana meditation, they're referring to the second one, right? We've got our right view, we've got our theoretical understanding, then we develop vipassana meditation, and then we have letting go. So right view, when used specifically, means this first one. It's having the right opinion about Dhamma, but it's also used in a more general sense to refer to the whole field of wisdom. Right? So in one sense, you can say, yes, right view can be used to mean all of these things, but specifically it's talking about the first one.
Bhante, we must get you back to talk about the Noble Eightfold Path. Very, very interesting. I must hand you over. I'm getting warning signs from my beloved wife here. We're overrunning.
I am so sorry, Wangmo.
No, I'm just being, conscious that you are, you've been talking for 2 hours and giving us really great, almost 2 hours. I think we started at 2, and I know that's just so much generosity and your wise reflections, and I think it's inspired all of us to come back to Sutra Central and look at what's available there. There's so much knowledge and so much effort that's being put into the translations. And this talk is just one example of the depth of looking at one sutra. But behind it, each word has a whole narrative exposition, and putting it into context is, it seems like so relevant just to understand the context of how those words are being used. to create meaning. And
Yeah.
so thank you, Bhante, for all of this great work in Dhamma, especially in modern conditions when we need to hear the Dharma and put it into, there's a sense of humor also that I really appreciate in today's talk, that it doesn't have to be totally so serious all the time, that we can take light.
We don't want to end up like Brahma.
That we can have a sense of humor, which I love. And you do it so well. And so thank you for just making it so alive and coming into our minds, so that we can really reflect wisely on these incredible teachings that the Buddha has left through the Dharma. I would like to just make one little plug-in for Vesak. We are trying to get 1 million candles lit. So I'm trying to spread the word to as many friends in Dharma.
You guys don't mess around, do you?
We don't mess around, so I have to put it out there. If everyone lights a candle on May 26th at 5 p.m., please, in the name of our Blessed One, the Buddha, the one who has gone forth to light a candle, may we join in peace, love, and unity together around the world with this lighting of the candle. And I hand it back to you, Bhante.
Thank you, Wangmo. When you say let's all light a candle at that time, my immediate thought goes to let's all light the candle at one time and let's all put it on the same Zoom session at the same time. And with 1 million people on one Zoom session, maybe we can just crash the whole internet. I don't know. But that's what.
We are going to do it live stream. So it's out there, but I don't know how many people will do that. But we're going to be able, we're trying to get as many people to send photos.
Okay, very good. So yeah, thank you so much, Wangmo, for organizing this, and thanks so much, Richard, for helping out, and thank you to everybody who's attending, and I really appreciate your presence and your Dhamma practice and your sincerity. And this is one of the things that I was really struck with when I spent time to become friends with Wangmo and Richard in our time in India, and I was really moved by their sincerity and their dedication to the Dhamma, and I found this really kind of something that's really beautiful and inspiring. Hopefully I'll be able to sometime come back to Berkeley and see you there. But look, I just randomly, I'm going to just throw this out, and I can see that Deepika is here. So Deepika is my supporter here in Sydney. And I'm just going to randomly throw this out, that we should sooner rather than later be doing a Buddhist chanting ceremony here in Sydney. So I'll just let you think about that, Wangmo and Richard, and we would love to host one here if you wanted to do one here at some point.
Well, it gives us an opportunity to come and see you.
Absolutely, right?
At the end of the world. What is it? I love it. The monastery at the end of the world.
Monastery at the end of the world. Yeah. All right. Okay. So thank you so much, everybody, and looking forward to seeing you again sometime soon.
Thank you.